Rory Quinn arrived at the Ashworth Ranch in the autumn of 1883, with exactly 11 cents in his pocket, a boot sole flapping loose from a nail he'd lost 3 days back, and a horse that belonged, strictly speaking, to a freighter in Laramie who had lent it on the understanding it would be returned within the week. He had come west from County Clare 4 years earlier with modest savings and considerable confidence in his own hardiness, both of which a crooked card game in Cheyenne had relieved him of entirely 2 weeks prior, leaving him to walk and beg rides the better part of 200 miles toward the one lead he had left, a rumor that the Ashworth spread was hiring hands for the fall gather. What Rory did not expect, riding up that dusty lane with his pride considerably more battered than his boot, was that the ranch's owner would turn out to be a woman barely 5 years his senior, dressed for riding rather than parlors, who looked him over with the frank, assessing patience of someone who had learned, recently and the hard way, not to judge a person's worth by the state of their boots. Her name was Eleanor Ashworth, and she had inherited this ranch from an uncle 8 months earlier, arriving from Boston with considerably more money than practical knowledge, and had spent every one of those 8 months learning, often at painful cost, precisely how little her Boston education had prepared her for the country she now owned. This is the story of two people who arrived at that ranch equally unprepared for the land in front of them, in entirely different ways, and of everything they taught each other before either of them understood it was happening. Eleanor Ashworth's Boston family had assumed, when her Uncle Edmund died and left her his failing Wyoming cattle operation, instead of the tidy sum they'd expected him to leave the family estate, that she would sell the ranch within the season and return east to the marriage prospects her mother had been carefully cultivating since Eleanor's 21st birthday. Eleanor had surprised everyone, herself included, by boarding a westbound train instead, arriving at a ranch she'd never seen with a trunk full of dresses entirely unsuited to the work ahead and a stubborn determination to understand, before she sold anything, exactly what her uncle had spent 30 years building. The learning had been brutal and constant. She had been thrown from a gentle mare twice in her first month, had ruined 2 good dresses learning to milk a temperamental cow, and had discovered, to her considerable fury, that her uncle's foreman, a man named Cyrus Pell, had been quietly skimming profits from the herd sales for at least 2 years, banking on an inexperienced Boston heiress being too naive or too eager to sell to ever notice the discrepancy in the ledgers. She had noticed within her 3rd week, having been raised by a father who ran a shipping concern and had taught his only daughter to read a balance sheet before she'd learned to dance, and had spent the months since carefully documenting Pell's fraud while working, twice as hard as anyone expected of her, to master enough practical ranching knowledge that Pell's continued employment became entirely unnecessary rather than merely unwelcome. She was standing at the corral fence with her uncle's old ledgers and a notebook of her own careful notes on cattle weights, when Rory rode up that October afternoon, and she took in his ruined boot and borrowed horse with the same clear-eyed assessment she now applied to everything on the ranch, weighing what he presented against what he might actually be worth to her operation. "You're limping," she observed, "and that horse isn't yours, and I'd guess by the accent you're not more than a few years off the boat. Tell me plainly why I should hire you over the 6 other drifters who've asked this month." Rory considered lying, the way he'd considered lying to the last several people who'd asked him hard questions about his circumstances, and found, studying Eleanor's frank expression, that dishonesty seemed unlikely to serve him with a woman who'd clearly already seen through several better liars than himself. "Because I know cattle from Clare to Cheyenne, and I lost every dollar I owned to a card cheat 2 weeks back. And I'm hungry enough that I'll work harder than any of your 6 other drifters just to prove I'm worth the wage," he said. "That's the truth of it, plain as I can give it." Eleanor studied him a long moment, something in his direct answer clearly landing better than practiced charm would have. "I appreciate honesty considerably more than most employers you've likely dealt with," she said. "I'll give you a week's trial, room and board, and half wages, until I've seen whether the cattle knowledge matches the confidence. I should warn you the operation here is smaller and considerably more precarious than it looks, and I have limited patience left for hands who assume a woman running a ranch needs managing rather than employing. Wouldn't dream of managing you, ma'am, Rory said. Managed poorly enough of my own affairs lately to have any confidence lecturing someone else's. Something almost like a smile crossed Eleanor's face at that, quickly suppressed, but not quickly enough that Rory missed it. We'll see how the week goes, Mr. Quinn, she said. Bunkhouse is past the barn. There's a cobbler's kit in the tack room, if that boot troubles you as much as it appears to. The week's trial revealed, within the first 2 days, that Rory's cattle knowledge was genuine and considerable. He handled a spooked steer with a calm competence that impressed even Eleanor's most skeptical remaining hands, and diagnosed a hoof problem in her prize bull that had been troubling the animal for a month without anyone else identifying the cause. What the week also revealed, to Rory's genuine surprise, was that Eleanor's Boston polish concealed a mind sharper with numbers and contracts than any rancher he'd worked for, and a growing, hard-won competence with the land itself that belied his initial assumption that she was merely playing at ranching until her money ran out, or her patience did. She caught him, on the 3rd day, studying her notebook of careful weight calculations and breeding records with an expression of genuine surprise, and addressed it directly rather than letting the moment pass unremarked. "You assumed I was an amateur playing dress-up in my dead uncle's boots," she said, not unkindly, "and I'll admit the assumption was reasonable 8 months ago. I've disabused a considerable number of people of it since, usually to their financial detriment when they'd bet against me." "Didn't mean any insult by the assumption," Rory said. "Only meant that most folks in your position sell within the season and go home considerably richer for the trouble. Can't say I've met many who stayed to learn the whole business from the ground up instead. My uncle built something here worth understanding before I decided whether it was worth keeping," Eleanor said. "I find, rather to my own surprise, that I've grown considerably attached to both the understanding and the keeping." Cyrus Pell, sensing that his skimming scheme was approaching discovery as Eleanor's competence grew and her scrutiny of the books sharpened, made his move 6 weeks into Rory's employment, attempting to rustle a portion of the fall herd off ranch land under cover of a supposed buyer's inspection, intending to sell the cattle privately and disappear before Eleanor's suspicions solidified into proof. Rory, riding the north fence line on an ordinary evening patrol, spotted the unauthorized movement of cattle toward the county road and rode back to warn Eleanor rather than confronting Pell's armed companions alone. Eleanor's response was immediate and considerably more decisive than Pell had accounted for. She had already prepared, over the preceding weeks, a formal accounting of every discrepancy in his management, copied and sent in advance to the county sheriff, along with a request that he be present at the ranch that very evening for an unrelated inspection she'd arranged as cover. When Pell's men reached the county road with the rustled cattle, they found the sheriff waiting rather than the buyer Pell had promised them, and the entire scheme collapsed within the hour. Pell himself arrested on charges that would keep him well occupied for considerably longer than a single failed cattle theft. "You knew he'd try something like this," Rory said afterward, watching the sheriff's wagon disappear down the road with Pell inside it. "And you'd already built the trap before I ever rode up with the warning." "I've been building it for weeks," Eleanor said. "Your warning simply told me the trap was about to spring, which mattered considerably, since I'd rather have caught him in the act than merely proven fraud after the fact. I'm grateful for the timing, Rory, more than the formal thanks I've already given you." A letter arrived from Eleanor's mother the following week, congratulating her on resolving the ranch's management troubles and informing her, with the particular firmness Boston mothers reserved for daughters who had wandered too long from expected paths, that a suitable match had been arranged with a shipping family's son and that Eleanor was expected home by Christmas to formalize the engagement properly. Eleanor read the letter twice at her writing desk and found herself considerably more troubled by it than she expected, given that she had spent the better part of a year building precisely the kind of independent life her mother's letter now casually proposed to dismantle. She did not mention the letter to Rory directly, though he noticed her unusual quiet over the following days, and finally asked her plainly one evening whether something troubled her badly enough to explain the change in her manner. "My mother has arranged a marriage for me in Boston," she said, watching the fire rather than him. "A shipping family's son, entirely suitable by every measure my family values, and I find myself considerably less enthusiastic about the prospect than a dutiful daughter probably ought to be." "Suppose that's your decision to make, not mine to weigh in on," Rory said carefully, though something in his voice carried more weight than the studied neutrality of his words. "I find myself curious, nonetheless, what weighing in you might offer, if I asked for it plainly," Eleanor said, looking up at him directly for the first time since the letter arrived. "I'd offer that a suitable match built on your family's ledger of acceptable families isn't the same thing as a life you'd choose freely, if freedom were genuinely on the table," Rory said. "And I'd offer that I've watched you build something here worth considerably more than any shipping fortune, brick by brick, with your own two hands, in a way I don't imagine any Boston parlor ever taught you to value quite this much." He paused, weighing his next words carefully. "And I'd offer, plainly, since you asked for plain weighing in, that I've come to care for you considerably more than an employee ought to care for his employer, and that watching you consider a Boston marriage has been harder on me than I expected it to be." Eleanor absorbed that with visible surprise, though not the kind of surprise that suggested the sentiment was unwelcome. "You've taught me to read weather and doctor a sick calf and stand my ground against a man like Pell without flinching," she said. "I find I've been considerably slower to notice what I might be teaching you in return, until just now. You've taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by the state of their boots when they arrive somewhere new," Rory said, "and that a woman raised for parlors can build something honest and lasting with her own hands, if she's stubborn enough to try. Taught me considerably more than that too, if I'm honest about it, though I hadn't quite found the words until this evening." Eleanor's reply to her mother, drafted carefully over the following week and posted before the season's first real snow, declined the Boston engagement plainly and permanently, citing both her ongoing commitment to the ranch and a private matter of the heart she did not elaborate on, beyond noting that her future had settled itself considerably more clearly than her mother's careful arrangements had accounted for. Her mother's response, when it eventually arrived, carried considerably more disappointment than surprise, and Eleanor found she could bear the disappointment without difficulty, having spent the past year learning exactly how much of her family's expectations she was willing to carry, and how much she intended, from now on, to set down. Rory's borrowed horse had long since been returned to its Laramie owner, replaced by a sound gelding Eleanor insisted on gifting him outright as fair payment for a year's honest work, and his boot had been properly cobbled within his first week at the ranch, though Eleanor liked to tease him, in the months since, that she'd known within the first 5 minutes of meeting him that the ruined boot mattered considerably less than the man standing in it. They married the following spring in the same ranch yard where Pell's rustling scheme had unraveled, with Eleanor's uncle's old hands, and neighbors gathered to witness a match neither of them had expected to find in a fall hiring conversation about ragged boots and borrowed horses. "You arrived here with nothing but a busted boot and a borrowed horse," Eleanor said that evening, watching the first snow of the season settle over the ranch they now ran together. "And I find, looking back on it, that I have never once regretted the hiring decision that followed." "Nor have I regretted the riding," Rory said, "though I'll admit I never once imagined, limping up that lane, that I'd end the year considerably richer in every measure that actually matters than I was the day I lost every dollar I owned to a Cheyenne card cheat." He drew her close against the cold. "Turns out the genuine fortune was standing at that corral fence the whole time, studying cattle with a notebook, wondering whether to trust a ragged Irishman's plain answers." "I trusted them considerably faster than I let on," Eleanor said, laughing softly, and together they turned back toward the warm, lit windows of the house her uncle had built and she had saved, and that both of them now, plainly and permanently, called home.